So today's webinar is entitled Impacts of Climate Change and Variability on Ocean Waves, and will be provided by two presenters. Our presenters today are Joao and Morim from the University of Griffith, who will cover the impacts of climate change on ocean waves. And our second presenter will be Dr. Andrew Marshall from the Bureau of Meteorology, who will discuss climate variability and their impacts on ocean waves. So Joao is a PhD candidate at the Griffith University and is affiliated with the Earth Systems and Climate Change Hub and CSIRO. His research focuses on understanding the long-term effects of increased anthropogenic forcing on global ocean wave climate and quantifying the magnitude of the underlying uncertainties. Joao's time is shared between contributing to the Coordinated Ocean Wave Climate Project, or COWCLIP, which he'll be talking about in his presentation, and working on international multidisciplinary research projects. Our second presenter, Andrew, is a senior research scientist at the Bureau of Meteorology in Hobart. He explores key drivers of global climate variability and extremes on multi-week to interannual timescales. Andrew's time is shared between developing the Bureau's seasonal forecast system, collaborating in Australian and international research clusters, and interfacing with operations and planning through the delivery of tailored climate briefings. Andrew is also the president of the Australian Meteorological and Oceanographic Society, or AMOS. So both presenters today contribute towards the Earth Systems and Climate Change Hub's Project 5.9, Marine and Coastal Climate Services for Extremes Information. So I think we might get started. So I'll pass over to you now, Joao. If you could unmute, and if everyone could stop their videos as well, that would be much appreciated, apart from Joao. So over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Sonia. Thank you all for attending this web seminar. So today we're gonna look into robustness and uncertainties in global wave climate projections. So this is a project between Griffith, CSIRO, and the COWCLIP. And as Sonia said, I'm affiliated with the Hub and CSIRO. So I'm going to be presenting on behalf of the COWCLIP group. And I'm going to cover three different topics today. So I'm going to start with a brief introduction and trying to provide an idea on why global waves are important. And it's important to understand how anthropogenic forcing will affect them. My second point will cover our results in terms of our developed projections at global scale. And the third point will cover some insight, conclusions, and key points. So we'll start with the introduction. So why are wind waves important? So obviously they're part of the system, and coastal climate adaptation assessments and planning require consideration of a wide range of different sea level drivers, amongst them mean changes, surges, and waves. On the left side, you have a picture showing the effects of wave-driven flooding on the Marshall Islands, and on your right-hand side, you have a wave-driven shoreline recession in a coastline in Senegal, Africa. These are two impacts of two wave-driven impacts that are important for our coastal adaptation planning. It's also important to understand how wind waves will behave in a warmer world. So obviously, surface waves, like any other system, will respond to variability and climate-driven changes. In this case, in atmospheric circulation, there are the drivers of ocean waves, and changes in storm tracks will drive changes in the global wave climate, and this will have consequences, geophysical ones, like I showed you before. Flooding and erosion will also impact socioeconomics, direct damage, infrastructure damage, and will also have will cause environmental issues such as saltwater intrusion and ecosystem destruction. For example, salt marsh erosion. On the right-hand side, we have a photo of the Gold Coast, again with aggravated erosion. due to superimposition of surges with waves. So current sea level setbacks. So most studies conducted so far that account for future problems surrounding sea level rise have systematically assumed stationary wave conditions. So wave conditions will remain the same in a warmer climate, or they simply have neglected the wave contribution to total water levels, for example, via wave setup. And therefore, these setbacks are likely too conservative, given that they don't account for the superimposition of waves, that is, atop, sea level rise, and surges. Therefore, understanding wave climate change provides potential opportunity to refine information for policymakers, like many of you guys. So, in this context, the Coordinated Wave Climate Project was created. It's a long-term project right now, about 10 years, and it puts together researchers from many different countries and different climate modeling centers. On the left, we have a meeting of last year, actually 2018, in Liverpool in the UK. COWCLIP has 4 primary key objectives. So we look into global wave projections, regional wave projections, wave GCM coupling development, and wave climate baseline characterization. Today, I'm going to talk about the global wave projections that aim to provide guidance for adaptation and impact studies. And that is the little box that is outlined in purple. COWCLIP is led by Dr. Mark Himmer from CSIRO. And as I said, I will be presenting these results on behalf of everyone that contributed to this work. So before going into more details, I would like to give a brief explanation on how waves are derived from atmospheric fields. So on your left side, you have GCMs, winds, and sea level pressure. GCM stands for Global Climate Models, part of the CMIP5 and CMIP experiments. And as I said, waves are driven by atmospheric fields, either surface winds or sea level pressure. Both can be used to generate a wave climate. Then on the purple box below the globe, we have the different uncertainties associated with these winds and with these sea level pressure simulations, future and historical. We have interscenario uncertainty rising from different representative concentration pathways called RCP. We also have uncertainty due to different models, global climate model forcing, so different GCMs that lead to different atmospheric patterns. And we also have intramodal uncertainty, for example, different initialization or starting conditions for the different GCM models. Obviously, as we go from the left to the right-hand side, our uncertainty increases. So this is our atmospheric base. So to obtain waves, we can use a dynamical downscaling approach or a statistical downscaling approach. This is on your right-hand side. And so on the statistical downscaling approach, we have different numerical wave models like WaveWatch3, WAM, amongst others. Those models can have also different source term physics. They can be calibrated in different ways, and they also can use different spectral numerical resolution as well as bathymetry and sea ice forcing. Statistical models, on the other hand, they're based on weather types and regression, multilinear regressions. They also rely on atmospheric fields from reanalysis, and they generally have a training period and a calibration period, and they can also have a bias correction applied to them. So all of this, we're gonna call it our wind wave modeling uncertainty or wave downscaling uncertainty. These uncertainties make the total uncertainty associated with the processes of projecting, of simulating future wave climate. So going on, so we know how to get the wave climate. However, our current understanding in future wave climate is still limited. And this is due to there is still a narrow sampling of the uncertainty space, There is little sample space overlap leading to unquantifiable uncertainty, which is a problem. And there is lack of scientific consensus amongst published work, prior published work, and there is a limited understanding of robustness. And when I say robustness, I say agreement between different models and whether the climate change signal stands out of the climate variability, so out of the historical variability of the climate, so to actually understand whether it's climate driven or not. So two big important questions are how robust are global wave projections and which sources of uncertainty dominate? So to answer this question, COWCLIP put together a large community ensemble of simulations produced under a pre-designed framework. Simulations have been obtained from 10 different standalone data sets developed by different climate modeling groups. There were about 10 different climate modeling groups from 10 different countries, including Australia. And we put together a total of 155 simulations of global wave climate scenarios to explore these two questions. So I'm going to give a brief description of the framework so you guys can understand. So on your left-hand side, you have the different modeling groups. So you have 8 dynamical groups, CSRO, and goes below and below the different ones. And you have your statistical ones, which is a Spanish Cantabrian group and the Canadian group on the two orange, within the orange box. Then we applied the community-based codes to have the same standardization amongst all the data sets, and so we could remove the unwanted uncertainty. And so the standardization led to same RCP scenarios, like I said, the same time slices of simulations, the same wave variables, same resolution and coverage. So this allows a standardized data set for analysis. We also processed this using a data referencing system, and the community data set is then available with 4 variables, 7 statistics, 17 timeframes at global scale at 1 degree. This information is now readily available to be used by scientists, IPCC, government stakeholders, and citizens. And I'm going to present some of the results that we obtained from this process. So going into these results, global wave climate projections, what do we have? So one of the questions is how much change are we going to face by the end of 21st century? So on the left-hand side, the first column, we have the historical climate from 1979 to 2004, mean climate. On the middle column, we have RCP 4.5 for the end of the century, 2081 to 2100. And on the right-hand column, we have under the high emission scenario, RCP 8.5, 2081 to 2100. So RCP 4.5 is a mild scenario of future greenhouse gas emissions, and RCP 8.5 a scenario of high emission. So we can see our 3 rows are significant wave height, annual, and then we have DJF stands for December to February, JJ8 stands for January to June to August. Then we have the 99th percentile significant wave height, mean wave period, and mean wave direction. So we can see that there is clear changes, especially for scenario RCP 8.5, which is a high emission scenario. We can see that most changes are increases we can see in the East Coast, in the Eastern Pacific, along the central and south coasts of the American continent, and actually in the Southern Ocean, affecting Australia and New Zealand for significant wave height. If we look at the 99th percentile, it's kind of the same pattern, but with less hatching. And the hatching, as indicated on the right-hand side of my presentation, stands for robustness. So you can see there's statistical significant models at 5% level and agreement between models. So it's where we are confident that these changes are climate-driven and they are significant. So we can see that there is an increase in wave periods in the Southern Ocean too, and in the Eastern Pacific, and rotation in the mean wave directions. On the other hand, we can see that the Western Pacific, Western North Pacific and North Atlantic faces decreases, have projected decreases in these regions, including in the period 2, which is coherent. So these are the range of change. It's about -10 to 10% for significant wave heights, extreme significant wave height, and mean wave direction in terms of degrees. And mean wave periods are likely to change between -5 and 5%. On the next slide, I show the summary of where our projections show robustness. So the title being approximately 40% of the world's coast shows robust changes in wave height, wave period, and or direction. So in at least 2 variables, with 50% of the world coast showing changes in one of these variables. So we can see the right-hand side color bar shows the quantitative change in directions between -17 degrees and +17 degrees clockwise. And the arrows in the maps stand for the direction in the historical climate, and the color of the arrows are the likely change in the future climate. The bottom color bar shows the combination, it's qualitative and shows the combination where wave period and direction might go up or down and vice versa, or the combination of 2 or 1 alone. So we can see that there is widespread coastal regions with changes in wave direction, and actually some of the regions where there is increase in significant wave height and mean wave periods, such as the western coast of Mexico, Chile, Peru, and the rest of Western South America. We also can see that South Australia, New Zealand, we have changes in significant wave height and direction, changes in period across the tropical Pacific. We can see, for example, in the Mediterranean Sea, we have decrease in significant wave height and mean wave period. Bear in mind that these projections are, so the colors and arrows indicated in this map are for robust changes. So changes that provide us a good degree of confidence that they're gonna happen. The remaining parts of the globe, either they're not robust, or if they are too up high in the North Pole, they won't be, they weren't analyzed due to sea ice and not all the models covering them. So another good perspective on how robust are these projections is to actually understand what contributes to the uncertainty. So like I explained before, we have uncertainty due to GCM, which stands for Global Climate Models, due to wind wave modeling methods, which stands for different dynamical and statistical modeling approaches to obtain the wave climate from the atmospheric fields. We have different RCP scenarios, which are representative concentration pathways, representing a mild scenario and a high emission scenario. And we also have nonlinear interactions, which is the interaction between all these uncertainties. So to partition these uncertainties, we apply the multi-factor ANOVA-based decomposition scheme with a subsampling approach applied to the significant wave height. And we can see we did this for the annual mean and for the different seasons, like we show on the right-hand side. And this partition can tell us what sources of uncertainty dominate in the different regions of the world. And for example, we can see that the RCP dominates a lot in the Southern Ocean, the North Atlantic, and off Japan. So this indicates that the emission scenario, it's actually a substantial contributor to our uncertainty. So the radiative forcing in the future, it's going to likely play a role. Obviously, with the partition of these uncertainties, we could identify that the wind wave modeling method, it's also a significant contributor. And if we put together all the different sub-columns on plot E, we estimate that it accounts for up to 50%. So most studies up to now have neglected this source of uncertainty, and we show it, then they are unlikely to have captured up to 50% of the uncertainty. On the next one, also, in addition to looking to the mean wave conditions, is also important, especially from the stakeholders' point of view and policymakers, to look at the frequency of extreme wave storms. These storms are very important in the sense that they drive significant erosion and pose significant repercussions for infrastructure and flooding. So in this work, we explore the World Climate Research Project expert team on climate change detection and indices. And over here, I'm going to show the results for 4 of those indices. So the first one being the number of rough wave days, number of days when daily max wave height exceeds 2.5 meters. Then we have high wave days, which is the number of days when daily max exceeds 6 meters, frequency of high wave days when daily max exceed the 90th% of the climate. And then we have the wave spell duration, which is at least 2 consecutive days when the daily max exceeds the 90th percentile of the mean conditions. So results, how much change by the end of the century again. So similar to what I've shown before, the left hand column labeled A is the historical climate, and the mid column is the RCP 8.5 high emission scenario, and it shows the relative changes between the historical climate and 2081-2100 climate. The last column is the latitudinal average changes, which is important to understand how these changes behave across different latitudes. The hatching stands again for robustness and accounts for the statistical significant models and agreement between different models. So we can see that the number of rough days, there is about a minus 25% to 25% change in a future climate. We have a decrease widespread across the northern hemisphere, and we have a strong increase of Western South America and Central America, and a small increase in the Southern Ocean too. Looking at the high wave days, we can see there is a strong increase in the number of days, 15 up to more than that, in the Southern Ocean. That's consistent with changes in wave height too that I previously shown, and that is very highlighted in the latitudinal map next to it. And then in the wave spell duration, which is the number of at least 2 consecutive days when the daily max exceeds the 90th percentile, so a good indicator of storminess, we have changes from minus 100% to 100% in the number of days. This is very significant. We can see that there is in the Southern Ocean up to 50%, so it will double the number of frequency of wave spell duration storm events. On the latitudinal plot, we can see that there is a strong increase in the Southern Ocean below minus 40 degrees is there, then a slight decrease in the Southern Pacific and Southern Indian, and a strong increase again in the tropical Pacific. We also computed the changes for the winds, and we can show that there is good agreement between the changes in the winds and changes in the storms, the frequency of storms. We also computed for the extreme wind speed that shows a similar pattern to the annual mean wind speed that is shown there. Obviously, we computed this for the same period and for the same scenario, so that it's all consistent. So my conclusions and key points that I would like you guys to take home. Point number 1, signals of wave climate change might not exceed that of natural climate variability if we meet our Paris Agreement of warming below 2 degrees. Under a high emission scenario, approximately 50% of the world's coast will be exposed to changes in force in coastal wave conditions. Number 3, the magnitude of future projected changes, about 5 to 15% in terms of mean wave climate, is capable of driving significant changes in coastal wave-driven processes and hazards. And number 4, previously analyses were unable to account for 50% of these uncertainties. This gives much more robustness to these results that we just presented. However, it's important to keep in our mind that we still yet to understand morphological driven changes. which in some instances might exceed the atmospheric-driven changes that I just previously presented. And by morphological-driven changes, I'm referring to changes due to changes in the bathymetry induced by sea level rise in combination with tides, and actually coastal morphological changes, long-term changes. Now, lastly, I would like to raise attention to, again, to the COWCLIP project, a big effort, a big long-term effort, has resulted in numerous interesting publications, the last one in Nature Wave Climate Change, making the cover. And this highlights the need for sustained funding programs and to actually get a strong global community engagement to answer the remaining questions and to actually use this and to develop solid adaptation planning and resolve other underlying uncertainties that still need to be addressed. And that is it, guys. Thank you so much. Best to you, Sonia.
Thanks, Joao. And while Andrew's just getting his presentation loaded, just a reminder that there is the chat box function in the Zoom taskbar, so do place your questions there and we'll address all questions for both presentations at the end. So yep, just a quick reminder. But apart from that, I think we're ready to go with Andrew. So I'll pass over to Andrew. Thank you.
Great, thanks very much, Sonia. I assume that you can all see my presentation okay. So I will start moving with this. So yeah, so we've just heard about the climate change impacts, and now I'd like to talk about climate variability. So my background is looking at modes of climate variability, or climate drivers. So these are looking at fluctuations in our climate system on timescales from days to weeks to months, and I will introduce those drivers in just a moment. Okay, so I'd like to say first, though, that the co-authors to this work are Mark Emer at CSIRO here in Hobart. So Mark has, of course, played a major role in this work. Harry Hendon at the Bureau of Meteorology in Melbourne. So Harry and I have worked together for many years on climate drivers and these modes of variability. Kathy McGuinness, the project leader at CSIRO in Aspendale, and also Tom Durant, who was at the Bureau when he was involved in one of the components of this work, is now in New Zealand. So the outline to the talk is as follows. I will introduce the climate drivers that I've assessed and that I'll be talking about today. So these are the tropical Madden-Julian Oscillation, the high southern latitude southern annular mode, and the middle latitude blocking. So I'll explain those drivers in a bit more detail and their mechanisms. I'll then talk about the data that that I used to do this work. So using a wave hindcast, and then of course present the results in terms of the impact of these drivers on wave heights. Okay, so starting off with the Madden-Julian Oscillation. So the MJO is the dominant mode of variability in the tropics on the multi-week or sub-seasonal timescale. So looking over timescales of weeks to a month or two. So the MJO is characterized by an eastward moving disturbance in the tropics. So it's a tropical phenomenon, and we have a large buildup of rainfall and cloud cover convection over the Indian Ocean. Coupled with this are zonal winds, so those west-east winds, where we have low-level inflow into that convective region and upper-level outflow, as is depicted on the slide. And this entire kind of coupled wind convection system moves eastward, and that characterizes the MJO propagation. So it cycles the globe along the equator towards the east. When the MJO active region, the active convective region, moves across from the Indian Ocean to the maritime continent just north of Australia, that convective rainfall signal really intensifies as it moves further eastward in its propagation over the Western Pacific to the Central Pacific, over the cooler water of the Central Pacific. That convective signal starts to decay, And further east, as the oscillation continues to propagate around the world, it's mostly observed in those upper level winds until it reaches the Indian Ocean region again, and the warmer surface waters there of the ocean, and the convection starts to build up again. Now, these events can occur with a general period of propagation, so the time it takes to circumnavigate the globe across the tropics, of around kind of 30 to 80 days on average. So it does vary, and it can build up and then decay anywhere kind of along that life cycle. So that's the MJO. Now the southern annular mode, so now over the South Pole really, or close to the South Pole, this is the largest mode of variability in that region, and it's generally characterized by a north-south shift in the westerly wind belt that circles the southern hemisphere. Often we see fluctuations in those winds, and when they shift towards the south, then we talk about the positive phase of the southern annular mode, so that those winds around the pole contract towards the pole, and we have a reduction in pressure, mean sea level pressure over the South Pole, and an increase in pressure around the middle latitude, so just kind of around just to the south of Australia. And then in the opposite phase, we see those westerlies, that westerly band expand towards the equator, and so then we see an increase of pressure over the South Pole and a reduction in pressure just south of Australia. And the southern annular mode can have impacts around the Australian region. We see many impacts. So, for example, over the spring and summer, we saw drier conditions, warmer conditions, and we had a negative phase of the southern annular mode. And so that's typically the response that we see for Australian climate, for example. So I'll extend that in this talk to look at surface waves. I should also mention that the MJO, which I just introduced, does also have far-reaching impacts and global impacts on monsoons, El Nino over the tropics, but also into the high latitudes of the northern hemisphere as well. We see large impacts over the Atlantic and the North Pacific oceans. So last of all, our atmospheric blocking split flow index. And so blocking is generally where we see high pressure systems that start to kind of develop or slow down just south of Australia and to the east of Australia over the Tasman Sea. They can occur, of course, to the west of Australia as well, but in the focus in this talk is looking at those highs around kind of the south and to the east of Australia. And typically when those highs develop around the kind of 45 to 50 degrees south latitude, we see a split in the westerly wind belt around that high. So I introduced those westerly winds before. So when we have these high pressure systems that kind of sit stationary for about 3 or 4 days on average, we see the westerly flow split around the high, and that's what I'm depicting here in this example on the left. So you can see there with those red arrows, which are highlighting the wind vectors in that plot, you can see how those westerlies split to the north and south of that high. Just on the equatorward side or the northward side of that high, we also see a low pressure system which cuts off and brings a lot of rainfall to the southeast of Australia. So last month in February, for example, we saw very strong split flow blocking, and we had a cut-off low that brought a lot of rainfall, as you'll remember, to parts of southeastern Australia, parts of the southeastern mainland there. On the right, it's just again another depiction of the winds. So when we have a split flow around that high, you see those westerlies increase to the north and to the south of Tasmania roughly, and around Tasmania we see those westerlies reduce, which is where the high pressure system is sitting. Okay, so that's those are the three drivers, and that's what we've been looking at with regards to the influences on surface waves. And so for this talk, I'll be focusing on wave height variability. We looked at a couple of other fields related to waves, such as energy flux and peak periods, but I'll just be focusing on the wave heights. So the aim of this work really is to benefit coastal management on these timescales from days to weeks to months with regards to these drivers. The other thing to note is that we can predict these drivers on that multi-week timescale. So about 2 weeks for the salmon blocking and 4 weeks for the MJO, and we're now kind of pushing beyond those limits. So this also brings into play the potential for prediction of ocean waves when we know what the impacts are from these drivers. So with regards to the wave heights that I'm showing you in this talk, so we're looking at the significant wave height, which is the average height of the highest third waves observed during a given period. So we're looking at daily data here. So within that day, the highest third of the waves that were observed, it's the average height of those. And the data that we use comes from what's called the CAWCR wave hindcast. So this is a data set, a gridded data set that's been produced. So it's a surface wave model, the WaveWatch 3, and it's been forced with surface winds from the Climate Forecast System reanalysis. These are very high resolution winds, and they're fed into the model, and the model produces a wave hindcast and a global wave data set of these different wave fields of very, very high resolution, so 0.4 degree horizontal resolution, and hourly output. But as I said, we looked at daily mean data in this work. So what are our impacts due to these drivers? So first of all, the MJO, and the kind of common thread here, of course, is that the signal in surface winds from these drivers is typically reflected in the significant wave height changes that we see on these timescales. So for the MJO generally, we see wave height variations of up to about 0.5 metre, not just over the tropics and around the Australian region, but up into the Northern Hemisphere as well. But I won't touch really too much on the Northern Hemisphere signal, but you can see that as we go, that there are remote teleconnections or connections between the tropical signal or the tropical driver and the extratropical winds and wave heights. So when the MJO is strong over the Indian Ocean, we see westerly anomalies to the west and easterly anomalies to the east flowing into that region of MJO convection. So those are shown on the left. This is for the November to April months. So everything in yellows and oranges are westerly anomalies and blues are the easterly anomalies. And you can see how this translates to variations in significant wave heights over those regions. So this depends on the background or the climatological winds. So for example, over those broad tropical regions there, the wind, the background winds are westerly. So where we have westerly anomalies on top of those westerlies, overall the wind strengthens and we have positive changes in significant wave heights. Where you have easterly anomalies just to the north of Australia, over the top of those westerly background winds, that reduces the wind flow, and we see a reduction in the significant wave heights. And so you can see that on the right. So everywhere that's yellow and orange is an increase in wave height, and blues are decreases in wave heights. And you can see, for example, for this phase of the MJO, when that convection is over the Indian Ocean, the impacts on wave heights. So around Australia, we see generally a decrease in wave heights of up to 0.5 metre. When the MJO moves on further east and it's strong over the Western Pacific, we see the opposite impact on wave heights. So now the zonal wind anomalies on the left of the slides there show an increase in westerly winds just to the north of Australia and around the maritime continent region. And so in that westerly background state, this overall increases the wave heights, and you see positive changes or increases in those wave heights around the northern Australian coasts, again up to about 0.5 metre, and quite a strong signal there on the northwest shelf you can see of up to 0.5 metre. So depending on the phase of the MJO, the surface wind signal that's associated with that driver drives these changes in significant wave heights of this magnitude. For the southern annular mode now, so this South Pole centered driver, we see a very strong signal in the surface zonal winds, so shown on the left there. So just to the south, just around the south of the Australian continent there, we see a reduction in the zonal winds when the SAM phase is positive, so that's where the winds have contracted towards the pole. So you can see that that shift illustrated in those anomalies. So we see a reduction in winds to the south of Australia and an increase in winds further south as those winds have contracted towards the pole. And the impact on significant wave heights in that region is quite strong. So again, up to about a half a metre around the Australian region and just to the south. So at the high latitudes where we see the westerly anomalies, the background state of the winds is westerly, strong westerly. So we see an overall increase in wave heights, and just to the south of Australia, we see a decrease. And we see some other changes around the Australian coasts as well, depending upon the background state of the winds upon which the anomalies are superimposed. But we do see how those vary. So that's the positive phase of this SAM. I should also mention that we did see a signal also in the northern hemisphere, but again, I won't talk about that here unless there are any questions at the end. So this is for the December to February period. And if we move to the negative phase of the SAM, so that's where those winds expand towards the equator, you can see the opposite sign signals. So just to the south of Australia, where we see an increase in westerly winds, we also see an increase in significant wave heights, again of up to about a half a metre. So so it's a significant response. The shading that I'm showing here does represent statistical significance to 95% confidence. So we can see that these are significant responses in the surface winds and the waves. And finally, blocking, so where we have this high pressure system just sitting to the south of Australia. So the zonal wind signal associated with blocking is shown there. This is for the winter months, for example. And so again, just around the Tasmanian latitudes, you can see that reduction in zonal winds, and to the north and south of that, this increase in winds as that westerly splits around the high. And to the right is the impact on significant wave heights. So to the south of Australia, where we have background westerlies, those easterly anomalies reduce the overall winds, and we see an overall reduction in the significant wave heights. So you can see right around the Australian continent there, around most of the coastal regions, we do see a reduction in wave heights of about 0.2, 0.4 metres, up to about 1 metre to the south of Australia in those in the region where the response is the greatest. So this does imply that we see calm wave conditions around the coast when we experience blocking events as those wave heights are reduced. So just to zoom in and summarise for the Australian coasts, so I'm just choosing some examples here. So on the far left there, that's the significant wave height for when the MJO is strong over the Western Pacific. So I showed that before. We see an increase in wave heights up to a half a metre around the Northern Australian coast and the Western Australian coast as well. In the middle there, for negative SAM in winter, again, we can see a significant impact, particularly there around the Western Australian coast or the southwestern Australian coast, and also around parts of southeastern Australia as well. And on the right for blocking in winter, again just zooming into the Australian region there, showing the magnitude of those changes in wave heights. Then the last thing that we did was to look at the likelihood of extreme high waves. So this is looking at the highest 5% of waves in the record that we looked at. So this is the likelihood of experiencing those extreme waves. So where everything is yellows and oranges, that's a higher chance than normal of experiencing these extreme waves, and blues are a lower chance than normal. And I'm just going to toggle between these two slides if I can. Here we go. Yep, so that's the anomalies, that's looking at the changes, that's looking at the likelihood of extremes. And you can see that where we see increases in significant wave heights, we also have an elevated chance of extreme high waves. And so this increase in wave heights can be up to 2 or 3 or even close to 4 times, depending on where you're looking at. So we do have an elevated chance. And of course, where we see a reduction in wave heights, we see a low chance of experiencing extreme waves. So I've just shown some example phases here, but we've published all of this work, and the full suite of plots is shown in those papers. So just some take-home points. So these results have implications for trends in wave conditions. So, for example, in climate projections, we see a wintertime decrease in blocking and summertime increases in blocking and the SAM projected. So, for example, there are potential implications of wintertime decreases in blocking on the natural capacity of Australia's beaches to recover after storms, for example. But this requires more investigation and was beyond the scope of our work here. The results suggest potential predictability of global wave variations on the sub-seasonal timescale. So I touched on this to begin with. So, we can predict the MJO out to 4 weeks or beyond 4 weeks now, and blocking in the SAM out to about 2 weeks. So this could have tremendous benefit for predicting global waves, knowing the impacts of those drivers on the waves. And the work also has the potential to provide coastal managers with timely information to help in making decisions for minimising wave damage to coastal communities and infrastructure. So we're looking at the potential benefits of understanding climate driver impacts, which can include anticipating wave-induced coastal inundation and long-term management of coasts, for example. So that's everything that I wanted to present today. So thanks very much for your attention, and I think we will now open the floor to any questions.
Fabulous. Thanks, Andrew. And thank you both to Andrew and Joao for their wonderful presentations. We do have around about 10 minutes for questions. So pop any questions that you have into that Zoom chat box so that we can address them to either of the presenters. Joao, I might ask you to start your video just so we can get stuck into some questions. Thank you very much. So our first question comes from Anna, who asks, what can be done to reduce the level of uncertainty in the analysis? And I think that was with regards to the projections. So over to you, Joao. Don't forget to unmute.
Hello. Thank you, Sonia. So to reduce the uncertainty in the projections, I mean, the fact that we use different variables and processes to get to our end goal would mean we can reduce the uncertainty associated with the wave models to better calibration and tuning. In terms of reducing the uncertainties in the global climate models, that might be even harder in the sense that that relates to other uncertainties like sea surface temperature, atmospheric circulation, and therefore I believe, for example, the CMIP6 will provide or will better resolve some processes that right now introduce a significant amount of uncertainty in the climate, such as tropical cyclone, for example. However, in our study, we didn't really have scope to further explore alternatives to improving or to reducing the uncertainty.
Okay, fabulous. The next question is, what negative impacts could occur in regions where there are reductions in wave energy? How do they compare with negative impacts from increased energy?
How can we prepare to...
So what negative impacts could occur in regions where there are reductions in wave energy?
Yeah, so obviously waves contribute to... Wave contributes to flooding via wave setup. However, there are other processes. For example, you can still have a decrease in significant wave height or mean wave period, but a shift in wave direction. And that shift in wave direction might drive some changes in sediment transport or influence other coastal processes in a way that can still lead to negative impacts. So that's why the wave field impacts in a different way at different timescales, and it's important to start incorporating not just the wave setup in our coastal assessments and planning, but also the impacts of wave direction.
Okay, fabulous, thank you. The next question is from Anna, who asks, this might be for both of you, I'm not sure. What role will in situ and satellite wave observations have for climate change predictions and climate variability? And how can observations be optimized to help? Who wants to tackle that first?
I'm happy to step in with regards to climate variability. So yeah, it's a good question, and yeah, we're actually looking at the moment at satellite wave observations. So a data set that Ian Young at the University of Melbourne has just recently published, and we're working with Ian to look at those wave measurements with regards to how they compare with the CAWCR wave data set, and also looking at trends in those data sets and seeing how they kind of compare with one another. So in terms of using satellite data, we're very keen to extend this work to look at those, and we've started to do that with regards to the drivers, and that kind of, I think, blends into the last part of the question in terms of optimization. Really, I think when we, as we develop these data sets, one of the first things we need to do, of course, is to compare the data sets and see, where we can tease out, for example, any kind of potential biases in any of these data sets, or any of the forcings that we haven't known about or haven't known so much about, in order to further refine the data sets that we can produce.
Yeah, I would like to make a quick comment on the role of these two observation data sets on climate change prediction. So on these projections, the projections we did, the simulations for the historical period have been compared to satellite observations, again from Ian Young's data set too. And also to wave reanalyses, which are observationally constrained. And so by understanding how well our wave models can represent these observations, it can gives you a certain level of confidence in how well they can represent the climate and therefore future conditions. Thank you.
Great, thanks a lot. The next question, I think, comes from Vanessa, and she asks, what is current thinking of what will happen to MJO and SAM in the future, climate timescales?
So in terms of the SAM, so the SAM is projected to continue to have a positive trend, and that's primarily in the summer months. So yeah, we've seen that over the last few decades. And in terms of the MJO, it's not really clear. The MJO operates on the multi-week timescales, and it very much responds to the underlying sea surface temperatures. So it does have a large dependency on the east-west gradient in sea surface temperatures. So if the gradient in SST changes, then we'd be likely to see that reflected in, for example, the propagation characteristics, those eastward propagating characteristics of the MJO. But that is still an area of active research at the moment.
Fabulous. All right. So that brings us to the last question. So there's still a couple of minutes, so if anyone has a last minute burning question, just pop it in the chat box there. In the meantime, I guess I'll just thank both of our presenters, both Andrew and Joao, for their fabulous and informative webinar presentations. Thank you everyone for attending and for popping in your questions. It's been really great. Just a reminder that this webinar has been recorded, and that we'll be posting a recording of the webinar on the Earth Systems and Climate Change Hub website by the end of the week, and an email will go out with the link to the appropriate webpage. If you have any questions or queries about today's webinar or the Hub's webinars in general, there's quite a few different ways that you can get in contact with the Hub. If you also have additional questions for the presenters, feel free to email us there at the info@nestclimate.com.au web email address, and I can pass on your questions to the presenters as appropriate. And finally, keep an eye out for the information and emails about the next Hub webinar, which will be around about the 21st of April. And that will be provided by Professor Nathan Bindoff from the University of Tasmania. And keeping on oceans themes, he's going to be giving an overview of the contents from the recently released IPCC Special Report on Oceans and Cryosphere in a Changing Climate. So that'll give some really policy relevant overview information of a whole range of ocean and cryosphere topics and issues. So I think we might end it there then. Thanks again for attending, and thanks to our presenters, and we hope to see you at the next Earth Systems and Climate Change Science webinars. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.